Right, hello and welcome. My name is Glenn Pinto. I work in education services, and I'm here with
Michelle Corona.
Michelle Corona. Where are you from?
New York, New York.
New York.
The
New York.
city's so big they named it twice.
Wow, I've never thought about that. I lived in New York, for 15 years, something like that. Went to school out there. But we're not talking about New York. We're talking about the CMDB, right?
Okay.
Which is a big topic. We wanted to cover a few new features that came out in Geneva around CMDB identification and reconciliation. And so what you see in front of you right now is the product documentation page for a lot of the items we're going to talk about. So prior to Geneva, I've worked a lot with different importing and transform maps and discovery and Service Watch, all these different sources that can populate the CMDB. And the question I always had was, well, what happens if you have two sources of data coming in and they want to create or update a CI in the CMDB? What happens? And basically, my canned answer was last update wins. So if ServiceNow Discovery came in and they created a record, and then Service Watch reconciled against some attribute on that device, whether it be the serial number or MAC address, and it had different attributes or different characteristics, it would actually update that record with whatever was Service Watch. And so that was good and bad. And the good thing was that it wouldn't create duplicates, but the bad thing is that you wouldn't really know what you're looking at, whether it's the data from Discovery or from Service Watch, or you didn't have control, I should say. Because there's actually a field called Discovery Source, which you can see who actually updated that record last. So they've done some really cool improvements in Geneva to help the identification process, which is the reconciliation process, and then control which data sources will take precedence or have priority to update a record if there's more than one source.
Okay, so there's two parts to this process of reconciliation.
Yes, yeah, there is. And let me show you just a few slides that we have in our discovery class. And this is the first piece. So there's now a new rules engine around identification. So if Discovery finds a Windows server, a Unix server, or a printer, it's going to create it if it's the first time it finds it. If it finds it again, it's going to do an update because it's going to go through this rules engine and say, is there a serial number that matches something that's in the CMDB? And if there is, then we're going to go ahead and update that record if any characteristics have been changed on the next discovery. So that's known as the identifiers. And so if you just type in identifiers on the left nav, you'll be able to find that new module that exists in Geneva. And if you look for the hardware rules, that's what you're seeing here, basically this hardware rules. So that's the first thing. This is really going to prevent duplicates from happening. But then what they've added are some additional features in Geneva that says, well, if we've created a record, which data sources have authority basically to perform updates on that CI? And so you can define here under this, there's a module called reconciliation definition. You can define those authoritative sources or data sources, and you can define it at the attribute level if you want to be that granular or that specific, or you can just apply it to a specific extended table level, like in this case, the Windows Server table, or you can apply it to hardware, which is actually the base table of everything that's discovered in the CMDB.
So, Glenn, you and I were talking before. What you're saying is that this kind of works like access controls, and that there's a hierarchy to how the rules are checked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So you can create rules on like an attribute level, which is like a field level, so to speak, or you can create it on the table level, which means it's going to apply to all of the fields within that table, or you can actually apply it above that, almost like task and incident, but this is like hardware and Windows Server table in terms of those rules.
Yep.
Okay. So once we've defined this reconciliation definition, there's also something called data source precedence, and this is where you define which of these data sources, if you have multiple data sources that can reconcile with the same CI, which one is allowed to perform updates, and should one perform an update over another? And so based on this, Michelle, we've talked about order. Do you remember what order means?
So usually, if there's two rules or two data sources, they have this. The order field is used. The higher number had, let's see, the lower order number has higher priority,
Yeah,
which was it can be different in different parts of the platform,
yeah,
but that's how it worked here.
exactly, exactly. So in this case, if Altiris were to create a record, and it was the first time, if Altiris, the data source, was to find the record, the first time a Windows server, it would create that record.
Right.
If Altiris were to find that same record 2 weeks later, it would be allowed to update that record. Okay. Let's say then you import, you perform an import, and you reconcile against the same attribute that that record was found from Altiris. The import would be allowed to occur and would allow to update because it has a lower order
Okay.
or a higher priority, as you said. And then let's say that ServiceNow found that same record and it reconciled, it would be allowed to update that record. And so at this point, when ServiceNow has actually updated that record, it's the discovery source for that record will show ServiceNow. And so if Altiris tries to update that record in the future, it will not allow it to occur.
I remember that. This is going to be one of the tests we actually do later.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and you'll see this all in action to kind of reinforce.
So when all of the data sources are sampled, then the one that has the highest priority is the one with the lowest order number.
Correct. And
Okay.
anything below that will not allow updates unless you have maybe field specific rules. So this is kind of a you'll see as we get into it, because you define whether it's field specific here or, as they say, attribute. Okay. Here's an example of based on this previous example. You'll notice that we have three sources, right? We have a ServiceNow as the lowest order or highest priority, and then import set Altiris. So this is kind of an example of what would happen. So let's say that Altiris comes in and it creates a server called XYZ with a disk space of 40 gigs, and it's the initial discovery, so it's allowed, right?
Okay.
No, the CI doesn't exist, so we're going to allow the creation. And then, just as I said before, let's say we create an import and we have maybe some new attributes in there. Maybe we have the owner, we have some other attributes around that CI, and we perform a transformation of some data coming from an Excel file. It's going to allow that that CI to be updated because import set had a higher priority than Altiris.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Then ServiceNow comes in, right, and it finds the same CI. It reconciles on name. And in fact, it sees the disk space is 40 gigs. It's going to allow an update to 40 gigs. Why? Because it's the higher priority.
Higher priority.
Right.
Okay.
So now we're at that point. Now you try to import again against that same CI, and you want to, maybe you're just running a regular import, and it says, no, you know what? It's 50 gigs. It's not going to allow that update. Why? Because import set is a lower priority than ServiceNow.
Right.
So your end result will be that in your CMDB, you'll have server XYZ with a 40 gig disk space. And that's important because prior to this, these rules engines, you would end up with a server with 50 gigs because you didn't have control over that. Because it's just doing a reconciliation on the name field, and it says, yeah, here's 50 gigs, and like I said before, last save wins.
So Glenn, what are the parts to the identification and reconciliation process?
All right, so we touched upon those. We're going to actually see them now in the system. So we talked about these identifiers. We talked about something called a reconciliation definition, and also something called data source precedence. So if you are in a Geneva instance and you type in reconciliation, you'll see this configuration menu. And below that, under identification reconciliation, you'll see where these three areas are. So there's the CI identifiers.
Okay, so that's the identification rules where something incoming from a data source will look at what's in the system and try to do the match.
Exactly. So if I click on CI identifiers, in Fuji and prior for discovery and so forth, there used to be a lot of script. And now it's much more configurable. A lot of these are service watch related. They're relating actually to applications. But for anything that's a CI specific, something like a printer or a Windows server, there are hardware reconciliation rules. And this is the one. It's basically called hardware rule.
Hey, so it would look like some two fields that it might look at would be like a serial number or serial number type.
Exactly. So let's go look at the rule real quick just so we see. So inside this rule, it's affecting CMDB CI hardware, which is, if you understand the CMDB structure, there is something called CMDB CI. That's kind of like the root of all tables. And then below that, you have kind of two branches. You have one going towards applications, and you have another extended table towards hardware. So everything that's a Windows server, a Unix, or a printer, or a network switch, a firewall, that's all considered hardware. And so there's all these extended tables off of hardware.
Right.
So this rule basically applies to that hardware table and all extended tables off of it. Okay, and down below are the rules. So all of you'll see some of them are actually false and some of them are active true. I'm just going to show matching on true. So there's really 4 rules, and it's going to try it in a specific order. Right here, you see 100 through 400. And this is going to say now forget about the other 2 things we talked about, reconciliation definitions and data source precedence. If we just have this, what we're going to do is we're going to look for a match on this. So the first time we find a CI, it's going to find no match, it's going to create it, right?
Okay.
Next time we find that same CI, it's going to go through this and say, is there anything with the same serial number type? If there's multiple matches with that, it's going to then say, is there anything with just a serial number that matches? And if not, is there a name or is there an IP MAC? So those are kind of it kind of goes test them one at a time. And when it finds one single match of any one of these elements, it will then realize that, oh, that record actually exists. I'm going to perform an update on that record if I have anything different in this last discovery.
Very good.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's what the identification or identifier does. But that doesn't take into place now different sources, right? If we just had this in place, then Altiris could update the record, ServiceNow could update the record, everyone can update the record, and the last one wins. So you still have that capability. If that's what works in an organization, you have that capability. That's why we call this an optional platform feature. So if I go to reconciliation definitions, there's where you can define a lot more. There's a bunch of service watch in there, but I created these for the sake of this demo and example. And in fact, I'm going to filter out this one that's not active. I've set up these 2 active rules that are in place. Right now it shows off of hardware. I'm going to go into the one that says ServiceNow. I'm going to make it Windows specific. Okay. So it's Windows Server. So CMDB CI Win Server is an extended table off of hardware. And I'm going to choose the field called disk space. So this is an attribute. So I'm building a rule, and this is all I care about. Anything else other than disk space on a Windows server, I have no rules on it. It'll update, last one wins, basically is the criteria. But I'm concerned about disk space. I know that in this example, I feel like ServiceNow is the better authoritative source. So I'm going to use these 2 platform features in order to make sure that if ServiceNow finds disk space, it's the one that's going to win.
Okay.
Okay. So where's disk space? So I have to switch it to Windows as my table.
Win server.
Win server. Here it is. And then I'm going to choose my attribute disk space. All right, so I have Windows Server selected, and I have disk space selected as well. So I'm going to update that. And you can see I don't have an order here. This is basically just saying which sources are allowed to update disk space in this particular extended table called Windows Server.
Okay.
Okay. Now, if both of them can update this record, we have to define a precedence, and that's where something called data source precedent comes into play.
Okay.
Okay, I have one that's set to false. I'm just going to remove it. And I'm also going to set this to Windows Server because we're going to use that other example with hardware later on. But for now, we're just going to define this with Windows Server, which is right there. And notice a couple of things. This kind of ties together with reconciliation definition. We're concerned only with the Windows Server, so anything Unix or printer or network, there's no rule around that. Okay. But if both sources can update that attribute that we defined on the reconciliation definition for disk space, we're saying that the one coming from ServiceNow will take precedence. It takes priority.
Okay, so continuing your story, we have 2 updates to disk space.
2 potential updates.
2 potential, because the system now is going to look at this and say, ServiceNow, that has the lower water number, higher priority.
Correct.
So it will do that.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. All right, and that's what we're going to test. So we're going to actually test these scenarios now. All right, Michelle. So we're going to continue to actually show you some use cases of the items we talked about. So we talked about the identifiers, we talked about reconciliation definition, and data source precedence. So now we're going to configure the system to meet certain criteria, and then we're going to run some use cases, run tests, and then actually see the result and see if it's the way we expect them to be.
Wow, that sounds great.
Okay?
But Glenn, before we continue,
Yes.
these data sources are really for updates. Can you talk again about how a record could be created, a CI record?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So this reconciliation definition is really around which data sources have the ability to update a specific record in a specific table like Windows, or a specific table and a specific attribute in a table, such in this case a Windows disk space, or any record in the hardware table and all of its extended tables. The creation of that record can be done manually.
Mm-hmm.
You could have imported the record before. You could have maybe discovered it from another discovery source that was not Altiris or ServiceNow. So the creation is really not managed here. It's more around the updating of that data that we're talking about.
That's, I think, a very important point.
Yeah. Okay, so in this case, this is going to be our initial setup, okay, Michelle? And if you looked at part one, our system is actually set up this way. We have a reconciliation definition of Altiris and ServiceNow that's basically looking and wants to manage the Windows Server table specifically, and specifically the attribute called disk space. That's all it cares about, okay? And we're saying we want to manage who gets to update that specific field, okay? So that's the first part. And the data source precedent says, well, if both of them can update that field, if both Altiris and ServiceNow find a Windows Server record with different disk space values, maybe they come at different times, then which one takes precedence? And so if you look at this down below, it says ServiceNow, data source ServiceNow has an order of 100, Altiris has an order of 200. So basically what our configuration states is that ServiceNow will allow updating, right? But if something that has been found by ServiceNow, Altiris will not be allowed to update that specific field.
This is an important point. Yes.
Okay. So are you good with that?
I am, but
Okay.
let me ask you this: if IBM came in
Mm-hmm.
and it had an order number of 300,
Mm-hmm.
we had said that the lower order number has highest priority. The IBM data source would not be allowed to update disk space either.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got
Assuming it found the same CI.
Okay, so
Okay.
even though we don't have a specific reconciliation definition defined, if another data source comes in, it's still not going to be able to.
Oh, that's correct for updating.
Very good.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead. So what we're going to do to simulate this, since we don't have Altiris as a discovery tool here available to us, we can simulate it running a background script. So you can do a lot of things through background scripts, but here we're basically going to create a payload similar to what we accept from other discovery tools. And so think of this as just a simulation, right? I can create a record in our CMDB in the Windows Server table with a name. In this case, it's called test precedence. It has an IP address and MAC address with some RAM, right, and disk space. And the source will be Altiris.
Okay.
Okay, so you might recall this is the first time this record is found, so it's going to create it, and everything should work well, right? So I'm going to take this and copy it right from here and navigate back to my, now you do have to elevate your privileges to find background scripts, scripts background, and I'm going to paste that inside here and click on Run Script. Now it did go through the reconciliation and the identifier said, is there a record with this MAC address or serial number or name? And it said no, right? So that allowed the creation of the record. And so if we go look at our Windows Server, because that's where it went, right, we should see test precedence. I didn't have a lot of attributes, but it came in with the RAM that we expected and the disk space that we expected. And notice the data source, discovery source. I actually had to configure the form to show this field. It's not there by default, but you can add that to the CMDB record if you want.
Okay.
All right, so we have Altiris now listed. Notice some of the other discovery sources that are here by default. All right, so that's really kind of validating that we got a record created. So our test result should be that we have a record that was created called test precedence, and it has disk space of 1,000, and the discovery source is Altiris. Okay, we're now going to simulate a record coming in from a discovery source of ServiceNow. It has different disk space, so I'm going to copy this out. Now, based on what we've set up in our engine, remember our initial configuration was we're going to allow ServiceNow to update disk space, right? Because it has a lower order or a higher priority.
Got it.
Right? So let's go run it. And I should really create a flyout, shouldn't I? I'm old school, I guess. Scripts background. And I'm going to run it. And now, ServiceNow is my input. I have 2,000 for disk space. You might remember Altiris had 1,000. I'm going to run it. And let's go test our record.
We got some good messages there.
Yeah, it said update. Notice it says update on the record on that sys ID. So now the identifier said, yes, we have a match on a name called test precedence, and it does update here ServiceNow as the discovery source, and it did update disk space because of the higher priority.
So it went from 1,000 from Altiris to 2,000 from ServiceNow.
Correct.
Okay.
So what do you think our third test will be? If we just updated with ServiceNow from Altiris, we're going to try to update back to Altiris.
Okay.
Because let's assume we're demoing the fact that, hey, Altiris is going to come in and maybe rediscover the same device 1 week later, and now it says, you know what, I'm finding 1,000, right? For whatever reason, just for the sake of argument. So I'm going to, in essence, this is the same script we ran the very first time.
During the creation of the CI record. Got
But
it.
now it's not a creation because it's going to reconcile through the identifiers that this exists in the system. So now we're going to do an update, right?
Right. Because now it's using those reconciliation definition records.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
Got it.
Okay. And if I paste this in, so what do you think is going to happen in this case?
I don't think the system is going to update.
Yeah.
I think that CI is going to stay with the ServiceNow data source.
So when I run it, it might be hard to read, but it actually says that the discovery source field update skipped for data source Altiris. The disk space field update skipped for data source Altiris, right? And that's because of that data source precedence that came into play. So we look at the Windows server, and I reopen that test precedence record. You'll notice that my source is still ServiceNow, and it's still 2,000.
Okay, so it did not allow Altiris to update that CI.
Exactly, and that's due to the data source precedence. Okay, and so that's a controllable feature. All right, so this next test is to just reinforce something else. So what we've done up to this point, you've seen running a script where Altiris was able to create the original record for test precedence, being the Windows server, and it created test precedence with a disk space of 1,000, right? Then we ran a script with a data source of ServiceNow, and ServiceNow had a disk space of 2,000 and allowed the update because of the higher priority for ServiceNow. Then we just tested last was, could Altiris go back and update that same attribute called disk space with 1,000 again, and it failed.
And it failed.
Right, and why was that? Because
ServiceNow was the authoritative source and had a lower order and higher priority.
Very good. Lower order, higher priority. Great. So what we're going to do now this time, since we've only built a rule, you might remember our reconciliation definition was only around a Windows server and disk space. We didn't care about any other field, only disk space. So if we tried to now update RAM, right, RAM was some other value, it wasn't 4,000, using Altiris, this is the test that was interesting. I was like, what's going to happen here?
Okay, so just to paraphrase this test, we have an existing CI, but no reconciliation definition for this RAM attribute.
Correct.
And the source is Altiris, which is not the authoritative source.
It has a lower priority.
It has
also.
a lower priority. So let's see what happens.
Yeah,
You got me curious.
I was curious about it, and I guess it did work the way I expected it to. But let's go take a look. And just to make those people that are watching this not go crazy, I did create favorites. So there's 1,000. So basically, the 4,000 is what's unique, and I create run. Whoop. What does it say here? So it does say disk space field update skipped. It does say discovery source field update skipped because of the priority and because of that specific rule. But let's go look at
Our RAM.
our
Our
RAM.
RAM.
That's what
That's
we
what
care
we
about.
want in
Look,
this
look at
one.
that. Boom.
Boom,
4,000.
4,000. It did it.
But it
Okay.
didn't change the discovery source and it didn't affect our disk space because we had a specific definition, reconciliation definition on those fields. But it did. So that creates an issue. Now, if you think about it, wait a sec. I don't really want to manage. Maybe you don't want to manage your CMDB based on every field attribute, right?
Mhm.
For every record in the Windows Server table. You might, because think about it, I'd have to create another reconciliation definition for Windows Server RAM and for Windows Server CPU type and building. It becomes a nightmare, right? So instead, what we can do, and this is what we're going to make a modification to, is on the reconciliation definition, I'm going to remove disk space. I'm going to take that away for our next test. What do you think is going to happen if I take away disk space from this reconciliation definition? It's going to, in essence, look at all fields. That's the default.
So this is starting to look a little bit more like access controls and how you can have different access controls set on tables and specific fields.
Exactly. So now, because I really don't have an attribute-specific rule, it's going to look at, okay, ServiceNow or Altiris can update any attribute, but which one's going to take precedence will be based on the precedence rules. So we have it set up where ServiceNow has precedence over Altiris.
Okay.
So let's run this next test. So before running this next test, I'm just going to go back to test precedence, the Windows Server, and set that RAM value back to its original. So when we run it again now, we're going to see whether we can update RAM to 4,000 again. Now that we've changed it, we're no longer just focused on that rule around disk space. We're now focused on anything that's a Windows Server.
Okay, so that's right. The last test we ran was increased RAM to 4, and you've brought it down to the original value.
Yeah, so we modified it back to 2048. We've already done this where we removed the attribute. And now, in essence, this test is the same script. Right? Okay. It's the same script we ran before where we were successful. But now, this time, when we run it, because of we removed that specific attribute, this is saying, can we update RAM to 1,000? Can we update disk space to 1,000? Right? And if I run the script, right, in essence, they are skipped.
Because of the authoritative source.
Because of the authoritative source, and there is no specific rule on one attribute.
Okay.
And you can see right here, it says even right here, field RAM update skipped for data source Altiris. So let's go validate that. I always like validating it. And you'll notice that 2048 and 2000 are the original values that came in from ServiceNow. So that's kind of a way that you would manage every attribute on the Windows Server table.
Glenn, this is really enlightening. But let me ask you, we've just figured out how to do the whole Windows Server table.
Correct.
But how about the Unix server table? Can we use the table and extended table structure to kind of make less rules and work the hierarchy of tables?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you had, let's say you wanted ServiceNow to be the really take precedence over Altiris for Windows, but maybe Altiris did a better job than ServiceNow for Unix. You could build the same structure for Unix, but just reverse the data source precedence for that. But if you want ServiceNow always to take precedence over Altiris for everything, then you can move up in the layers of the extended tables and base tables to whatever layer you want. And so to prove that point, what we've done is we've basically just modified our existing rules, and instead of it being based on CMDB CI Win server, we've now made the rule based on CMDB CI hardware.
There we go. That's how you do it.
Yeah. So now this says anything CMDB CI hardware or extended from will take, these rules will come into play. And so it's saying I'm allowed to update only from 2 sources. I can create from any source, but I can update only from 2 sources.
That's
ServiceNow and Altiris. Yes, just to reinforce that. But then down here below, we're saying that if we are updating from 2 sources, which one takes precedence? In this case, ServiceNow.
Okay.
Of course. I think I'd be beat over the head if I changed that order around. But yeah, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to run basically the same test. I'm going to try to update RAM, right, to 4,000 using Altiris based on this changed rule. So we just verified that if I took away the field attribute, which I did in this case also, notice there's no field attribute level. So I'm managing all attributes of all fields, of all tables extended up hardware. Then if I run this test, what do you think should happen?
Let's see. I think that our precedence rules, our authoritative source rules, are going to hold.
Yeah.
Even though we're at a different part in the table structure.
And look, boom, they all got skipped.
They all got skipped.
Yeah, so we can go look at our rules. So we had our definition that was on CMDB hardware, no attribute. And our precedence basically said ServiceNow over Altiris.
Of
right?
course.
Of course. Of course. And if we go look at our test precedence Windows Server, notice we did not bring in the RAM or disk space for Altiris.
Perfect.
So that's a really easy way to manage everything. So if you know for sure that, if I'm going to allow creation from anywhere, but if I do have something get updated from ServiceNow, I don't want any other source to update anything brought in from ServiceNow. That's the best way and easiest way to configure it. One rule, basically.
One rule to rule them all.
That's to rule the world,
Go.
All right, let's move on to one more set of tests. All right, Michelle, we're almost there, almost at the end, and you'll be able to get to our Christmas party, which is starting shortly. You're dressed in your all red this evening. But let's look. We have two more tests, and these are around importing. So if you want to add another authoritative source, reconciliation definition, notice I just added import set in this case. Same table, hardware, so it's going to affect all tables below hardware, all extended tables. And then I've set import set with an order of 300. And again, to reinforce, what does 300 mean?
Okay, so that is a lower priority because it has a higher order number.
Yeah, very good. You're good at that. Better than I am. I get those mixed up all the time.
I keep telling myself that rule, Glenn.
All right. So when I run what I've done now is I've created a simple source document which has the name of the Windows server we've been playing with called test precedence. And I have some unique or new RAM values that were picked up in this spreadsheet. It must be an old spreadsheet or something, and the values are completely way off. But we're going to try to import this in. And so I'm going to create a transform map, which maps those three fields, and we're going to coalesce on the name field, and we're going to run it, and we'll see what happens. So based on what you see here, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, since I know the authoritative source is ServiceNow, and this is an import set, I'm not sure.
Okay, well, let's go see. So I have, just to validate, I've now activated my import set data source precedence. It's got a value of 300. And I have my definition here for import set also set to true. Those were turned off before, but now they're turned on. And then I'm going to go to import set. All right, now that I'm at the import set table, I've actually loaded the data prior, so into an import set. So let's just go look at that data. I have a very simple record in here, and you'll notice that I have a name field that has been loaded with two values for RAM, one for disk space, and they're both 7,000. Okay. And because it's been loaded before, I have to reprocess this import set, so it's loaded and it can be transformed again. And let's go look at the transform map. So here's my transform map. I'm targeting the Windows Server table, which is extended off hardware. That's my source, where we just looked at the data that was in it. And I've already done the mapping, simple mapping, disk space to disk space, RAM to RAM, and name to name, and coalesced on name.
Okay, that's what I was looking for, the coalesce field.
Okay. And then just going to transform it and see what happens based on all our rules and everything in place. If I go look at, there's actually an import log. You can see some information here. It doesn't talk about inserts, but it does talk about an update.
Okay.
Which would make me think, well, I'm not very good at looking at log files unless I really have to. So let's go look at our Windows server and see exactly what happened.
So we did an import, and it looks like the import set did not respect our authoritative source or actually even use the information and reconciliation engine.
Yeah, that's true, because now we're seeing RAM. It actually did do an update.
It did the updates.
Yeah, so you might recall my question to you, do you think it's going to do an update or not? And it didn't. So what happens is by default, if you create a transform map and you just set a coalesce value, it's just going to do a query against that coalesce value. In this case, we had name, and it's going to say, yep, name exists there. We're going to do an update. So that's actually the default action of the transform map. Now, if you wanted to respect all the rules that we have in place, when you run your transform map, you have to build something called an on before script.
Okay.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you put an on before script, and basically you can just copy and paste the script, so whether you understand it or not doesn't really matter. But if you wanted to respect the rules we have in place, then you have to put that on before script in place. So I'm going to put this back to 2000 and this back to, I think it was 2048. It doesn't really matter. Something different than 7000.
Yeah.
You also notice that the discovery source still also shows ServiceNow. So it did do an update, didn't respect it. We didn't update the discovery source field, so it didn't change it, right? Basically, it's almost like its own world the way we brought in the data. So that can be very misleading. And you might have spreadsheets of data that you want to bring in. You set all these great rules in place, and you want to make sure that you respect them. So that's our last test, and let's go and look. So our result here was what shows up on here, right? We actually were updating those two fields. Our next test is going to be running another transformation. I set the values back already, but I'm going to basically use this on before script. So in the transform map, I have a transformation script related list where I can build an on before script. And here is basically the code you have to copy and paste.
Okay.
What this is basically saying is it's calling an API. It's going to be calling the API engine. In fact, it's commented here. It says call CMDB API to do identification and reconciliation of a current row.
And there it is.
Yeah.
Okay. Now it's going to look at the identification and reconciliation rules.
Yeah. So let's go again. Look at the.
And an on before. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to the import set. So this is the second import set. I'm going to reprocess that and then go to transform maps. And I have a second transform map. This is number 2, which is calling on that second data source. Same data, but I just, it's just in a different import set. And down below, same mapping here, but the only difference is that under transform scripts, I had clicked new and I built this on before script. Now this is a copy and paste, right? You don't have to modify it. You don't have to change anything. You basically just copy and paste. And this on before script is now going to call the identification engine and respect all our rules that we put in place.
Perfect.
Okay. So let's run that and test.
So Glenn, this will work for any import set.
This will work for any data coming in through a transformation map. Yeah.
Okay.
And basically any import set. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to run it. And let's look at our import log, see if there's anything useful. Now we actually see stuff about things being ignored. Again, sometimes it's helpful. It does see this stuff being skipped, right? So if we are lucky, let's go look at our test precedent server, right? And it was not updated this time.
Okay, because it wasn't ServiceNow.
Because it wasn't ServiceNow.
That's
ServiceNow
pretty
is the
much
lowest
it.
part. So let's do one last thing.
Okay.
Let's just do one last thing. I'm going to go to my precedents, and I'm going to change that to a 50.
To a 50. Okay. Now
I'm going to run the
the
same.
import set has lowest order, highest priority.
Yeah, so if I go to import sets, and this one, I'm going to just reprocess it.
Okay.
And go to the transformation. I can actually, I can just transform it, right? Because this is the one that has the onboard script.
Okay.
If it was the first one, it would do it anyway, right? But now that I've changed the order where import set is lowest, if I transform, we would expect. All right, so we're on the Windows test precedent server record. And so what do we see?
Okay, I'm going to look for 3 changes here. The 2 values, the 700 for RAM, 7,000 for RAM, and the disk space of 7,000. Hey, it did it. The import set had the order of 50, so it did process, did do those updates. But the third change I was looking for was the discovery source. Did that get changed from ServiceNow to import set? And it did.
And it did, yeah.
Because that now is the authoritative source.
Exactly. So if we were trying to run any of the scripts where Altiris or ServiceNow was the source, it would not allow any updates,
And there,
just as we had been
yeah,
testing before. So again, the takeaway here is that this is optional baseline functionality that's part of the platform. I think it's great because it's something that has been brought up many times in a lot of the ITOM classes around, which source wins sort of thing. And now that, ServiceNow can be at the root of an enterprise in terms of its de facto CMDB, we need to have better control over which records are in there and then which records get updated and by what, right? And this provides really great controls over how you can accomplish that within the Geneva release.
Well, thanks, Glenn.
Yeah, you're welcome. So just in case any of you want to go through any of these test cases, I do have this Word document or PDF that is available, and you can run through it on any Geneva release patch 1 or greater. All right, thanks everyone for listening, and I hope you learned a few things.